Before he was a portrait on a $20 bill. Before he was the 7th President of the United States, Andrew Jackson was a feeling. He was the raw, unbridled spirit of a young nation grappling with its own identity, a nation born of violence, steeped in contradiction and propelled by a furious, indomitable will. To understand Jackson is to plunge one's hands into the very soil of the American frontier, to feel its grit, its promise, and its profound brutality. It is not a story for the faint of heart. It is a saga etched in blood, sweat, and tears, a narrative of a man who was as much a product of his violent times as he was a shaper of them. He was the orphan boy who became a father to a new political era, the unlettered frontiersman who bent the nation's destiny to his will, the champion of the common man who owned other men as slaves, the Fury and the Forge. Andrew Jackson and the American Soul is an exploration of this monumental and divisive figure, a journey into the crucible that created him. It begins in the wild, unforgiving backcountry of the Carolinas, a place of constant peril where survival was a daily struggle, and life was as cheap as the land was vast. It is here, in the poverty and violence of the Waxhaws, that the seeds of Jackson's iron will were planted. We will witness the boy forged into a man by the searing flames of the Revolutionary War, a conflict that stole his entire family and left him an orphan, scarred by loss and imbued with a lifelong, burning hatred for the British aristocracy and the entitled power they represented. This biography seeks to understand the man through the emotions that drove him, the volcanic rage that fueled his infamous duels, the fierce loyalty he reserved for his wife and his soldiers, the paternalistic sense of duty that guided his command, and the unyielding fury at the perceived injustice of the corrupt bargain that would redefine American politics. We will march with him through the swamps of the Creek War, stand beside him on the parapets of New Orleans as he forged a legendary victory from a ragtag army, and follow his ascent as Old Hickory, the living embodiment of a new, muscular, and often ruthless American populism. His life was a testament to the idea that a single, determined individual, powered by sheer force of personality and a profound connection to the grievances of the people, could tear down old structures and build a new world in his own image. But this creation came at a terrible cost, and his legacy remains a battleground, a reflection of the dualities that lie at the heart of the American experiment: liberty and bondage, democracy and demagoguery, justice and vengeance. This is the story of the fury that consumed him and the forge that made him eternal. Chapter 1. Born on the Frontier. Poverty, Violence and Survival. The air in the Waxhaw settlement in the 1760s was thick with the scent of pine, damp earth, and the ever-present smoke of hearth fires. It was a place teetering on the edge of the known world, a rugged tapestry of dense forests and crude clearings carved out by the sheer force of human will. Here, along the border of North and South Carolina, life was a raw, visceral thing, a daily confrontation with the elemental forces of nature and the simmering tensions of a nascent society. Into this world, on March 15, 1767, Andrew Jackson was born, a posthumous son whose first breath was a gasp of sorrow and hardship. His father, also named Andrew, had been crushed just weeks earlier in a logging accident, his body broken beneath the weight of the very wilderness he had sought to tame. From his first moment, Jackson's existence was defined by absence, by the gaping void of a father he would never know. His mother, Elizabeth Hutchinson Jackson, was a woman of formidable resilience, a linen weaver who had crossed the Atlantic from Carrickfergus Island with her husband and 2 young sons, Hugh and Robert, seeking a life free from the poverty and oppression of their homeland. They were Scots-Irish, a people known for their fierce independence, their clannish loyalty, and a deep-seated distrust of distant, arbitrary authority traits that would become the very bedrock of their youngest son's character. But the promise of America was not a gentle one. For immigrants like the Jacksons, it was a bargain made with a savage Eden. The land was fertile but unforgiving. The freedom was palpable, but so was the danger. Wolves and panthers stalked the woods. Disease could sweep through a cabin like a phantom. and the boundary between settler and Native American territory was a line drawn in suspicion, and Blood Dot Elizabeth, now a widow with 3 small boys, found refuge in the home of her sister, Jane Crawford. The Jackson boys grew up not in a nuclear family, but in the sprawling, communal embrace of their extended kin. It was a world devoid of luxury. Their home was a simple log cabin, its walls chinked with mud and moss to keep out the biting winds. Floors were often bare-packed earth, and the flickering light of a tallow candle or the glow from the hearth was the only defense against the profound darkness that swallowed the frontier. At night, poverty was not a condition, it was the atmosphere. Food was what could be grown, hunted, or foraged. Corn was the staple in pony, in grits, in mash. A successful deer hunt was cause for celebration, a hedge against the hunger of the coming months. This environment was a crucible of character. Young Andrew was known as a headstrong and volatile boy, quick to anger and fiercely protective of his own perceived rights. He was not a bookish child. The wilderness was his classroom. He learned to read the forest, to track game, to ride horses with a reckless abandon that bordered on the suicidal. He learned the language of survival, a lexicon written in hardship and loss. He saw violence as a natural part of the landscape. Disputes between neighbors were not always settled by law, which was a distant and often abstract concept, but by fists, knives, or the long rifle that hung over every fireplace. He learned that respect was not given but earned, often through a demonstration of physical courage and an unwillingness to back down. This was the code of the backcountry, a brutal but simple ethos that would guide him for the rest of his life. His scrawny frame and shock of sandy red hair belied a spirit forged of pure iron, a temperament that, when provoked, could explode with terrifying force. He led the other boys in their rough games, his intensity often turning play into something more serious, a contest of wills he was determined to win at any cost. This was not just a game. It was a rehearsal for the life that awaited him, a life where every encounter was a potential battle, every stranger a potential threat, and every loss a wound to the soul. Chapter 2, Forged by War, Orphanhood and Early Hardship, the pastoral, if perilous, world of Andrew Jackson's boyhood was shattered by a distant thunder that grew steadily louder, the drums of the American Revolution. For the settlers in the Carolina backcountry, the war was not initially a grand ideological struggle fought by uniformed armies on faraway fields. It was a vicious, intimate, and terrifying civil war. It erupted not as a single cataclysm, but as a series of brutal skirmishes that pitted neighbor against neighbor, loyalist against patriot. The conflict tore through the Waxhaws like a firestorm, turning the familiar woods and streams into a landscape of ambush, reprisal, and massacre. Loyalty was a matter of life and death, and neutrality was a luxury no one could afford. The Jackson family, with their ingrained Scots-Irish distrust of British authority, needed no convincing. Their allegiance was unequivocally with the cause of independence. In 1779, the eldest brother, Hugh, a boy of only 16, joined a local militia unit under Colonel William Richardson Davy. He was not a soldier in a grand army, but a partisan, a guerrilla fighter. He saw action at the Battle of Stono Ferry, a grueling and chaotic engagement fought in the oppressive heat of a South Carolina summer. Hugh survived the battle itself, but succumbed to heat stroke and exhaustion on the march home, his young life extinguished not by a British musket ball, but by the sheer physical toll of war. His death was the first crack in the foundation of Andrew's world, a painful reminder of the war's insatiable appetite. He was only 12 years old, and already he had felt the cold touch of patriotic sacrifice. A year later, the war crashed directly into their lives with the force of a hurricane. The British, under Lord Cornwallis, had shifted their strategy to the south, and the red-coated regulars, accompanied by their ruthless dragoon commander Banastre Tarleton, swept through the Carolinas. In May 1780, Tarleton's forces caught a contingent of patriot militia at the Waxhaws in what became known as Buford's Massacre. The British gave no quarter, cutting down surrendering men in a frenzy of violence. Andrew and his brother Robert, serving as couriers and scouts for the militia, witnessed the aftermath of field of butchered friends and neighbors. The sight of the mangled bodies, the smell of blood in the summer air, seared itself into the 13-year-old's memory. This was not the noble war of pamphlets and declarations. This was intimate, savage butchery. The brothers soon found themselves directly in the path of the enemy. In 1781, they were captured by British dragoons. What happened next would become a core element of the Jackson legend. A British officer, his uniform a brilliant scarlet symbol of everything Andrew had come to despise, ordered the boy to clean the mud from his polished boots. Looking the officer squarely in the eye, the defiant boy refused, declaring that he was a prisoner of war and demanded to be treated as such, not as a servant. Enraged by this insolence from a scrawny, red-headed rebel, the officer drew his sword and slashed at him. Andrew raised his left hand to parry the blow, which cut deep to the bone, and the blade also gashed his head. The physical scars would eventually fade, but the psychological wound would fester for a lifetime. It was a searing, personal embodiment of British arrogance and tyranny. His brother Robert, who also refused, was struck a more severe blow. The boys were then marched 40 miles to a prison camp in Camden, South Carolina. The conditions were horrific. They were thrown into a crowded, squalid stockade with hundreds of other prisoners, given no medicine and barely enough food to survive. Smallpox, the great scourge of the era, swept through the prison. Both Andrew and Robert contracted the deadly disease. They became gaunt specters, racked with fever and covered in agonizing pustules. Their mother, Elizabeth, upon hearing of their capture and sickness, undertook a heroic journey to Camden. In a desperate act of maternal devotion, she negotiated a prisoner exchange, securing the release of her 2 sons and several neighbors. The journey home was a death march. The 2 fever-ridden boys, one with a festering head wound, stumbled and swayed, supported by their frantic mother. Robert's condition worsened rapidly, and he died just 2 days after they arrived home. Andrew was now the last of her sons. He had watched his entire family be consumed, one, by the revolution. He too was near death, delirious with fever for weeks. But his mother's tireless nursing and his own ferocious will to live pulled him back from the brink. But the war was not finished with its cruel work. Once Andrew had recovered, Elizabeth, a woman of boundless compassion, volunteered to travel to Charleston to nurse American prisoners of war, held captive on disease-ridden British prison ships. It was a mission of mercy from which she would not return. She contracted cholera or ship fever and died, buried in an unmarked grave far from home. A small bundle of her belongings was all that was sent back to her last surviving son. At the age of 14, Andrew Jackson was utterly alone in the world, an orphan of the Revolution, his heart a smoldering ember of grief and rage. The war had taken his father's place, his brothers, and his mother. It had forged him in the fires of loss, leaving him with nothing but a sword-scarred hand, a legacy of sorrow and a deep, abiding, and personal hatred that would burn within him for the rest of his days. Chapter 3, Law, Land, and Ambition, Jackson's Rise on the Frontier. The end of the Revolutionary War left a 14-year-old Andrew Jackson adrift in a world that had taken everything from him, an orphan with a small inheritance that he quickly squandered on the fleeting pleasures of horses, gambling, and fine clothes in Charleston. He seemed destined for obscurity. The grief and rage that burned within him had no productive outlet, and for a few years he drifted, a restless spirit in a restless nation. He briefly tried his hand at saddle making and even taught school, but his fiery temperament and boundless ambition could not be contained by such modest professions. The frontier was expanding, and for a young man with no family ties and a hunger for advancement, the law offered a path not necessarily to justice, but to power, land, and status. In 1784, Jackson moved to Salisbury, North Carolina, a bustling hub of legal and commercial activity. There, he entered the world of law, not through formal schooling, but through the common practice of the day, apprenticeship. He read law in the offices of prominent attorneys, first Spruce McKay and then Colonel John Stokes, a veteran whose own battle wounds were a testament to the recent conflict. Jackson was not a diligent scholar. He was far more drawn to the boisterous social life of the town, the horse races, the cockfights, the taverns filled with the loud talk of land speculation and politics. His contemporaries remembered him less for his legal acumen and more for his rollicking and sometimes menacing presence. He was, as one put it, the most roaring, rollicking, game-cocking, card-playing, horse-racing, mischievous fellow in town. Yet, beneath this boisterous exterior, he was absorbing the practical mechanics of power on the frontier. He learned that law was a tool, an instrument for enforcing contracts, securing land titles, and collecting debts, the very sinews of a society built on credit and speculation. In 1787, at the age of 20, Andrew Jackson was admitted to the North Carolina bar. A year later, his ambition found its true north, the Western Districts, the vast territory that would soon become the state of Tennessee. His friend and fellow lawyer John McNary had been appointed as Superior Court judge for the region, and he offered Jackson the post of public prosecutor. It was an opportunity freighted with both immense promise and extreme peril. They set out for the settlement of Nashville, a remote outpost on the Cumberland River, a tiny island of civilization, in a vast sea of wilderness still fiercely contested by the Cherokee and Creek nations. The journey itself was a trial. The small party of pioneers traveled a hostile road, constantly on guard against attack. One night, as Jackson sat awake, the hooting of owls seemed unnatural, too close and too numerous. His frontier instincts, honed in his youth, screamed a warning. He woke his companions, insisting they move on immediately. They packed in haste and pushed into the darkness, and the next morning, a party of hunters found their recent campsite surrounded by the tracks of a large Native American war party. Andrew Jackson's vigilance had saved them from an ambush. He had arrived in his new home, a land where the law was a whisper and violence was a roar. Nashville in 1788 was a lawless place. It was a debtor's haven, a collection of rough-hewn cabins filled with men who had fled their financial obligations back east. The existing legal system was paralyzed, as creditors could find no lawyer willing to take their cases against the powerful debtor class. Jackson, as the new public prosecutor, changed that overnight. He was fearless and relentless. In his first month, he issued over 70 writs to delinquent debtors. He was not intimidated by their threats or their social standing. He was the arm of the law, and he wielded his authority like a weapon. He quickly established a reputation as a man who got things done, a man who could not be cowed. This work, while making him enemies, also brought him powerful allies among the creditor and merchant classes. His payment was often not in cash, which was scarce, but in land. Jackson shrewdly began to accumulate vast tracts of territory, laying the foundation for his future wealth. He understood with a primal clarity that on the frontier, land was the ultimate source of power, independence, and gentility. At the same time, his life became inextricably entwined with the most prominent family in the settlement, the Donelsons. He took up lodging at the blockhouse of Rachel Stockley Donelson, the widow of the settlement's co-founder. There, he met her daughter, Rachel Donelson Roberts, a woman of captivating beauty, warmth, and spirit. She was, however, a married woman, trapped in an unhappy and abusive union with Captain Lewis Roberts of Kentucky, a man consumed by a jealous, suspicious nature. Jackson, the orphan who had never known a stable family, was drawn to her light, and she to his fierce, protective nature. A deep and passionate affection grew between them, setting the stage for a scandal that would haunt them for the rest of their lives, and fuel some of the most violent episodes of Jackson's tempestuous career. Chapter 4. A man of duels and honor, temperament and reputation. In the raw, burgeoning society of the Tennessee frontier, a man's honor was his most valuable possession. It was an invisible armor, more vital than a land title and more potent than a long rifle. For Andrew Jackson, whose entire life had been a battle against insignificance and loss, honor was a religion, and his reputation was its sacred text. To insult his name, to question his integrity, almost unforgivably to cast aspersions on the character of his beloved Rachel, was to commit a sacrilege that could only be cleansed with blood. His life became a long and brutal series of confrontations, governed by the unwritten but rigidly enforced code Duello, a ritual of honor that elevated personal vengeance to a principle of gentlemanly conduct. Jackson's volcanic temper was legendary. It was not a simple flaw in his character, but the very engine of his being. Friends and enemies alike described his rage as a physical force, a storm that would gather in his piercing blue eyes before erupting with terrifying fury. His lean, towering frame would seem to grow. His voice would cut like a lash, and he would be consumed by a single-minded, unyielding purpose. This temperament was forged in the Scots-Irish culture of his youth, which viewed backing down from a challenge as the ultimate disgrace, and hardened by a life that had taught him that only the strong and ruthless survive. He was, by some counts, involved in over 100 quarrels, challenges, and violent altercations, ranging from tavern brawls to formal duels. The most profound and lasting source of these conflicts was the complex and controversial circumstances of his marriage. He and Rachel Donaldson Roberts had fallen deeply in love while she was still legally bound to the abusive Lewis Roberts. Believing Roberts had secured a divorce, they married in 1791. 2 years later, they were horrified to discover that the divorce had only just been finalized, and their marriage had technically been an adulterous and bigamous union. They immediately and quietly remarried, but the damage was done. The story became a dark stain on their reputation, a weapon that Jackson's political and personal enemies would wield against him with cruel precision. For the rest of his life, for Jackson, every whisper against Rachel's honor was a fresh attack, a personal assault that ignited his most primal, protective instincts. This simmering rage found its ultimate expression on May 30th, 1806, on a dueling ground in Logan County, Kentucky. His opponent was Charles Dickinson, a fellow horse breeder and accomplished attorney, reputed to be the finest marksman in all of Tennessee. The quarrel had begun over a horse race wager, but had escalated into a deeply personal feud. Dickinson, connected to a rival political faction, had publicly called Jackson a worthless scoundrel, a poltroon, and a coward. More damningly, he had made insulting remarks about Rachel, slurring her name in a tavern. The challenge was issued. The duel was inevitable. The morning of the duel was cloaked in a grim solemnity. The two men, with their seconds, met in a poplar grove. The terms were savage: to stand at 24 feet, closer than the customary distance, and fire on command. Jackson knew Dickinson's reputation. He knew his opponent would aim for the heart and would not miss. He devised a cold, calculated, and breathtakingly risky strategy. He would hold his fire, take Dickinson's first shot, and rely on his own iron will to survive the impact and take his own deliberate aim. He wore a loose-fitting coat, hoping to deceive Dickinson's perception of where his heart lay at the command fire. Dickinson fired instantly. A puff of dust erupted from Jackson's coat just over his heart. His body convulsed from the impact and his left boot filled with blood. His second, seeing the wound, cried out, "My God, General, are you hit?" Jackson, pressing a hand to his chest, stood firm. "Oh, I believe he has pinked me a little," he gritted out, "but I'll get him." Dickinson, horrified that Jackson was still standing, was forced by the rules of the code to remain on his mark. A helpless target, Jackson, calm and deliberate, raised his pistol. He took careful aim. The image of his beloved Rachel and the sting of Dickinson's insults steeling his resolve. He squeezed the trigger. The hammer clicked down on a half-cocked pistol and misfire. Under the code, this counted as his shot, but Jackson, in a cold fury, recocked the weapon. Dickinson could only watch in terror. Jackson aimed again and fired. The ball struck Dickinson in the abdomen. He fell, mortally wounded, and would die in agony hours later. The bullet from Dickinson's pistol had lodged in Jackson's chest, shattering to ribs and embedding itself just inches from his heart. It was too dangerous to remove, and it would remain there for the rest of his life, a constant, painful reminder of the price of honor. The duel was a sensation. Many were horrified by Jackson's cold-blooded conduct, but for others, it solidified his legend. He was a man who would literally stand in the face of death, absorb a bullet meant to kill him, and without flinching, dispatch his enemy to defend his and his wife's name. It was a terrifying, awe-inspiring demonstration of a will that could not be broken. Chapter 5, Soldier of the Republic, the Creek War. The War of 1812 was, for much of the United States, a distant and frustrating affair of naval duels on the high seas and failed invasions of Canada. But in the southern frontier, it ignited a brutal and deeply personal conflict that would provide the stage for Andrew Jackson's transformation from a controversial duelist into a formidable military commander. The catalyst was a civil war within the Creek Nation, a powerful confederacy of Native American peoples who occupied vast territories in what is now Alabama and Georgia. A faction known as the Red Sticks, inspired by the pan-Indian resistance movement of the Shawnee leader Tecumseh, and secretly supplied by the British and Spanish, sought to reject American encroachment and return to traditional ways. They began attacking assimilationist Creeks and, inevitably, the white settlements that pressed in on their lands. The simmering conflict exploded into open war on August 30, 1813. A large force of Red Stick warriors descended on Fort Mims, a crude stockade north of Mobile, Alabama, packed with settlers, friendly Creeks, and militia. The attack was a whirlwind of shocking violence. The Red Sticks overran the fort's defenses and carried out a horrific massacre, slaughtering over 250 men, women, and children. News of the Fort Mims massacre sent a wave of terror and outrage across the frontier. Cries for vengeance were immediate and deafening. The state of Tennessee called upon the major general of its militia, a 46-year-old man who was, at that very moment, laid up in bed, recovering from a near-fatal brawl where his shoulder had been shattered by a pistol ball. That man was Andrew Jackson. Consumed by a patriot's fury and a thirst for retribution, Jackson refused to let his debilitating injury stop him. His arm was in a sling, his body weak, but his will was pure steel. He rose from his sick, issued a call for volunteers, and within weeks had assembled a force of over 2,000 men. "The health of your general is restored," he declared to his troops. "He will command in person." He was a fearsome sight, a gaunt, erect figure whose piercing blue eyes burned with an almost messianic intensity. His men, rough and tumble frontiersmen like himself, began to call him Old Hickory, for he was, like the toughest wood in the forest, hard and unbending. The campaign that followed was one of unimaginable hardship. Jackson drove his army south into the heart of Creek territory, a wild and uncharted land. The logistical challenges were staggering. Supply lines, stretching for hundreds of miles over primitive trails, broke down almost immediately. The men were starving sometimes, reduced to eating acorns. Their shoes disintegrated, and they marched barefoot over frozen, rocky ground. Disease swept through the camps. Discontent festered, and entire regiments threatened to desert. Whose enlistment terms expired? In one famous incident, Jackson, his useless left arm still in its sling, used his right to level a musket at a company of his own men, who were attempting to abandon the campaign. He stood before them, a lone, indomitable figure, and swore he would shoot the first man who took another step. They stared into his blazing eyes, saw the utter certainty of his threat, and turned back to camp. Despite the near-constant state of mutiny and starvation, Jackson was a relentless commander. He waged a war of annihilation against the Red Sticks. He understood his enemy and adopted their own tactics of swift, terrifying raids. His strategy was to find the main Red Stick force and destroy it in a single, decisive battle. He found his opportunity in late March 1814. Nearly 1,000 Red Stick warriors, along with hundreds of women and children, had fortified a bend in the Tallapoosa River known as Tohopeka or Horseshoe Bend. It was a formidable defensive position, a peninsula protected on 3 sides by the river and on the 4th by a massive, expertly constructed log barricade. On the morning of March 27th, Jackson's army now bolstered by regulars and allied Cherokee and Lower Creek warriors, surrounded the encampment. He began with an artillery bombardment that proved largely ineffective against the sturdy rampart. The key to the battle came when his Cherokee allies swam the river and began attacking the Red Stick village from the rear, setting fire to the huts and creating a crucial diversion. Seeing his chance, Jackson ordered a frontal assault. The Tennessee militia, with Jackson's protege Sam Houston among the first over the top, surged across the open field under a hail of arrows and musket fire and stormed the barricade. The fighting was hand-to-hand, a brutal, desperate struggle. The Red Sticks, trapped and refusing to surrender, fought with incredible bravery, but they were overwhelmed. Jackson's forces showed no mercy. The battle became a slaughter. By the end of the day, nearly 900 Red Stick warriors were dead, many shot while trying to flee across the river. The power of the Red Sticks was broken forever. The victory at Horseshoe Bend was total and terrifying, and it made Major General Andrew Jackson the most feared and celebrated military commander in the American South. Chapter 6: Victory at New Orleans. A national hero is born. The crushing victory at Horseshoe Bend had secured the southern frontier, but the nation's fate still hung precariously in the balance. By the autumn of 1814, the War of 1812 had reached its grim nadir. The British, having defeated Napoleon in Europe, were now free to turn the full might of their empire against the upstart United States. They had captured and burned Washington, D.C., sending the president fleeing into the countryside. Now, their sights were set on the jewel of the Mississippi Valley, New Orleans. To capture New Orleans was to seize the artery of the American West, choking off its commerce and potentially dismembering the young republic. A massive British invasion fleet, carrying thousands of seasoned veterans of the Napoleonic Wars, was sailing across the Gulf of Mexico. The city was in a state of panic. Its defenses were weak. Its population a fractious mix of Creoles, Americans, Spanish and French, and its leadership was paralyzed with fear. Into this cauldron of anxiety rode Major General Andrew Jackson, newly commissioned into the U.S. Army and given command of the Gulf Coast. He arrived in New Orleans on December 1, 1814, a tall, gaunt, and exhausted figure, still suffering from the lingering effects of his multiple wounds and chronic dysentery. But his spirit was incandescent. From the moment he arrived, he radiated an aura of absolute command and unwavering confidence that electrified the city. He immediately declared martial law, a controversial but necessary move that subordinated all civil authority to his military will. He tolerated no dissent, no defeatism. Those who are not for us are against us, he declared, his voice ringing. With grim certainty, he faced a seemingly impossible task. The British Expeditionary Force under General Sir Edward Pakenham, brother-in-law of the Duke of Wellington, was a professional, disciplined, and battle-hardened army of over 8,000 men. Jackson's own forces were a motley, almost comical, collection of disparate units. He had a few hundred U.S. Army regulars, but the bulk of his army was composed of Tennessee and Kentucky militia fierce, but undisciplined riflemen, local Creole aristocrats, and a battalion of free men of color. To this already eclectic mix, Jackson made a pragmatic and audacious addition. He accepted the services of Jean Lafitte and his Brotarian pirates, pardoning them for their crimes in exchange for their cannons, their flints, and their expertise. As artilleryman, he saw not a rabble, but fighters. He saw not their differences, but their shared interest in defending the city. He forged them, through the sheer force of his personality, into a unified fighting force, ignoring calls to defend the city from within its walls. Jackson chose his ground with strategic genius. He established his main line of defense south of the city, along an old, abandoned waterway called the Rodriguez Canal. It was a formidable position. His right flank was anchored on the Mississippi River, his left in an impassable cypress swamp. His men worked around the clock, digging a deep trench and piling the earth into a high rampart, reinforcing it with cotton bales and mud. It was here, behind this crude but effective wall, that Old Hickory would make his stand. The main British assault came before dawn on the foggy morning of January 8, 1815. Pakenham, overconfident and contemptuous of the American rabble, ordered a full frontal attack. As the fog lifted, the Americans on the parapet stared in awe and horror. The field before them was a sea of redcoats advancing in perfect, disciplined lines, their bayonets glistening, the sound of their bagpipes cutting through the morning air. It was one of the most powerful armies on earth, marching as if on parade. Jackson walked calmly along his line, his voice steady. "Stand to your guns, boys," he said. "Don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes." The Kentucky and Tennessee riflemen, the finest marksmen in the world, rested their long rifles on the rampart and waited. When the British came within range, the order was given. The American line exploded in a sheet of flame. The first volley was devastating, ripping huge gaps in the British lines. But the redcoats, disciplined to a fault, closed ranks and kept coming. The Americans, using a system where riflemen in the rear loaded for those in the front, poured a continuous, terrifyingly accurate fire into the advancing columns. It was not a battle. It was an execution. The open field became a killing ground. British officers were targeted and fell in droves. General Pakenham himself was hit, and as he was lifted onto a horse to rally his men, a blast of grape shot tore through his body, killing him instantly. Two other British generals were also killed, or mortally wounded. Within less than an hour, the attack had completely dissolved. The British suffered over 2,000 casualties, including nearly 300 killed. Jackson's losses were staggering in their triviality: 13 killed and a few dozen wounded. The greatest land victory in American history had been won. The nation, starved for good news, erupted in delirious celebration. Unbeknownst to them, a peace treaty had already been signed in Ghent, Belgium, weeks earlier. But in the hearts and minds of the American people, the War of 1812 was won on the plains of Chalmette by the hero of New Orleans, Andrew Jackson. He was no longer a regional figure. He was a living legend, the savior of the Republic, a demigod of the American people. Chapter 7. Power Through Popularity, the making of a populist icon. Before he was a symbol, before he was a president, Andrew Jackson was a feeling. He was the gnawing hunger of the dirt farmer, the defiant pride of the backwoodsman, the simmering rage of the forgotten soldier. His existence was etched not in the polished mahogany of a Virginia plantation, but in the rough-hewn logs of a Carolina frontier cabin. Born in 1767 into a world of peril and privation, his father, a Scots-Irish immigrant, died just weeks before his birth, leaving his mother, Elizabeth, to raise 3 sons in the unforgiving wilderness. This was a land without safety nets, where life was a daily struggle against the elements, against poverty, and against the ever-present threat of violence. The sorrow that clung to his birth would become a constant companion, a spectre that hardened the boy into a man who met the world with a clenched fist and a wary eye. His childhood was not a time of learning and play, but a baptism by fire in the crucible of the American Revolution. The war was not a distant affair of marching armies and grand pronouncements. It was a brutal, intimate civil conflict that tore through the Carolina backcountry, pitting neighbor against neighbor. The Jacksons were fervent patriots, and the war came for them with a vengeance. His eldest brother, Hugh, died of heat exhaustion after a battle. Andrew, barely a teenager, and his brother Robert served as couriers for the local militia. Captured by the British, they were treated not as soldiers but as rebels, in a moment that would become central to his personal mythology. The boy Andrew was ordered to clean a British officer's boots. When he refused, citing his rights as a prisoner of war, the officer's sword flashed, slashing open the boy's hand and head. The physical scars would eventually fade, but the emotional wounded deep, abiding hatred for the British and for any form of arrogant, entitled authority would fester for the rest of his life. Imprisoned under horrific conditions, the brothers contracted smallpox. Their mother, a woman of indomitable spirit, managed to arrange their release, but it was too late for Robert, who died shortly after. In a final act of selfless courage, Elizabeth went to nurse American prisoners of war held on prison ships in Charleston Harbor, where she contracted cholera and died, buried in an unmarked grave. By the age of 14, Andrew Jackson was an orphan, utterly alone, his heart a smouldering ruin of grief and rage. This crucible of loss did not break him. It forged him into something hard and resilient. He drifted for a time, a wild, reckless youth known for his fiery temper, his love of gambling, and his fierce sense of honor. He found his path in the study of law, a profession that offered a ladder out of the backwoods and into a position of influence. He moved west to Tennessee, to the raw, burgeoning settlement of Nashville, a place where a man's future was limited only by his ambition and his nerve. Jackson had an abundance of both. As a young prosecutor, he was tough and unrelenting, earning a reputation as a man who got things done. He bought land, acquired slaves, and built a life for himself, culminating in his marriage to Rachel Donaldson, Roberts, the love of his life. A love affair that would itself become a source of both profound joy and devastating political pain. But it was as a soldier that the legend of Andrew Jackson was truly born. The War of 1812 provided tea. He staged, sent to fight the Creek Nation, allies of the British in the Mississippi Territory. Jackson proved to be a commander of terrifying effectiveness and brutal determination. He drove his men relentlessly, sharing their hardships and earning their undying loyalty. They nicknamed him Old Hickory, for he was as tough and unbending as the wood of that tree. At the Battle of Horseshoe Bend, he crushed the Creek forces, forcing upon them a treaty that seized 23 million acres of their land. Yet his crowning glory, the moment that catapulted him from regional hero to national icon, came at the very end of the war, in January 1815, at New Orleans. Jackson commanded a ragtag army of frontiersmen, militia, pirates, and regular soldiers. Against them was a massive, disciplined force of British veterans who had defeated Napoleon. Odds were impossible, but in a stunning, bloody rout, Jackson's men decimated the attacking British forces, inflicting over 1,000 casualties while suffering fewer than 100. The news electrified the nation. In a war that had seen the burning of the capital and a series of humiliating defeats, here was a glorious, unambiguous victory. Jackson was no longer just a general, he was the nation's savior, the embodiment of American grit and righteous power. The Battle of New Orleans, for technically after the peace treaty had been signed, was mythologically the true end of the Revolution. It was the moment America, in the person of Andrew Jackson, had stood up to the old world and unequivocally won. This image, the lean, fierce commander standing resolute against the forces of empire, was burned into the public consciousness. It was the foundation of a new kind of power. A power derived not from political maneuvering but from the raw, emotional adoration of the people. They saw in him not an aristocrat, but one of them a man who had known sorrow, who had fought for his honor, and who had delivered them a victory for the ages. The populist icon had been made. Chapter 8, The Corrupt Bargain, Defeat and Fury in 1824. The air in Washington in the autumn of 1824 was thick with a tension that was both exhilarating and poisonous. The era of good feelings, that brief, illusory period of one-party rule under James Monroe, was gasping its last breath. The nation was fracturing along lines of geography, ambition, and ideology, and the presidential contest to succeed Monroe was a reflection of that splintering soul. It was not a battle between two parties, but a chaotic melee between the titans of the same Republican Party, each a regional champion, each convinced of his own destiny. There was John Quincy Adams of Massachusetts, the son of a president, the brilliant and puritanical Secretary of State, a man who seemed to embody the cold, intellectual aristocracy of New England. From the South came William H. Crawford of Georgia, the Secretary of the Treasury, a giant of a man who was the chosen successor of the party establishment. The so-called Virginia dynasty, before a debilitating stroke cast a pall over his candidacy. And then there was the suave and charming Henry Clay of Kentucky, the great compromiser, Speaker of the House, a man of dazzling political skill and boundless ambition. the champion of his American system of national development. Against these three seasoned politicians stood a figure of a different mold entirely, Andrew Jackson of Tennessee. He was not a creature of Washington's drawing rooms. He was a force of nature, a living legend whose popularity was an organic wildfire phenomenon. His supporters saw in him the raw, untamed spirit of the frontier, a hero who had bled for the nation while the others had debated and schemed. His candidacy was an emotional outpouring, a rock cry from the farmers, mechanics, and frontiersmen who felt that the government had grown distant, corrupt, and beholden to the interests of bankers and coastal elites. Jackson himself was initially reluctant, but the groundswell of support was too powerful to ignore. He was the people's candidate, a man propelled forward not by a caucus of congressmen, but by a tidal wave of popular adoration. He represented a terrifying new form of politics, one that threatened to sweep away the old order. As the election results trickled in during the fall, a constitutional crisis began to take shape. The numbers told a story of a nation divided. Andrew Jackson was the undeniable popular favorite. He won a plurality of the popular vote and the most electoral votes, 99, but it was not enough. Adams came in second with 84, Crawford a distant third with 41, and Clay trailed with 37. No candidate had secured the required majority in the Electoral College. A feeling of dread and betrayal began to seep into the Jackson camp. They had won the race, yet the prize was being denied them. The Constitution, in its cold, dispassionate wisdom, dictated the next step. The election would be thrown to the House of Representatives, where each state delegation would cast a single vote. For one of the top three candidates, suddenly, the fourth-place finisher, Henry Clay, became the most powerful man in Washington. As Speaker of the House, his influence was immense. He was out of the running for the presidency himself, but he was now the kingmaker. The city became a hive of frantic, whispered negotiations. Corridors and parlors buzzed with offers and counteroffers. The future of the Republic, it seemed, was being decided not by the will of the people, but in secret backroom deals. Jackson, a man who loathed intrigue and valued directness above all, could only watch from a distance, his contempt for the political class growing with each passing day. He believed the choice was obvious. He was the people's choice. The House had a moral duty to ratify their verdict. To do otherwise would be a subversion of democracy itself. Clay was faced with a monumental decision. He despised Jackson, viewing him as a dangerous military chieftain, a potential tyrant unfit for the presidency, a man who would subordinate the rule of law to his own iron will. He and Jackson were also bitter Western rivals. John Quincy Adams, on the other hand, was a man whose political ideology, particularly his support for national infrastructure projects and a protective tariff, aligned far more closely with Clay's own American system. The choice for Clay was a pragmatic one. In a fateful meeting, Clay and Adams conferred. No one knows for certain what was said, what promises were made, but what followed seemed to confirm the worst fears of the Jacksonians. The House of Representatives convened on February 9, 1825. With Clay wielding his considerable power as Speaker, state delegations were swayed. Votes were marshaled, and on the very first ballot, John Quincy Adams was elected the sixth President of the United States. The outcry was immediate and volcanic. Just a few days later, Adams announced his choice for Secretary of State, the most prestigious cabinet post and a traditional stepping stone to the presidency. It was Henry Clay. For Jackson and his supporters, this was the final, damning proof. The sequence of events was too perfect, too cynical. A deal had been struck. Clay had sold his support in the House for the promise of a high office. It was, they thundered, a corrupt bargain, a flagrant betrayal of the popular will, a sordid transaction that had stolen the presidency from the people's hero and handed it to a man who had come in second. Jackson's fury was immense, a cold, controlled rage that would fuel him for the next few years. He wrote to a friend, his pen dripping with contempt. The Judas of the West has closed the contract and will receive the 30 pieces of silver. The sense of injustice was not just a political grievance, it was a deep, personal wound. It confirmed everything he had ever believed about the Washington establishment, that it was a den of elitist conspirators who held the common man in contempt. The defeat of 1824 was not end, it was the beginning of a war to redeem the Republic from the corrupt bargainers and restore the government to its rightful owners, the people. Chapter 9, The People's Campaign. Winning the presidency. The corrupt bargain was not a setback. It was a battle cry. The moment John Quincy Adams was declared president by the House, the campaign for 1828 began. It would be a 4-year war of attrition, a political struggle of unprecedented bitterness and intensity that would forever change the landscape of American democracy. Andrew Jackson, simmering with a righteous fury, returned to his home, the Hermitage in Tennessee, not to retire but to marshal his forces. He was no longer just a candidate. He was the living embodiment of a populist crusade. His supporters, a vast and growing coalition of farmers, urban laborers, southern planters, and western frontiersmen, felt a profound sense of theft. The hero had been cheated, and by extension, they had been cheated. The election of 1828 became a mission of vengeance and vindication. This was not a campaign of ideas in the traditional sense. It was a battle of personalities and symbols, waged with a ferocity that shocked the old political establishment. The Jacksonian movement, coalescing into the new Democratic Party, was a marvel of organization. Under the guidance of brilliant political operatives like Martin Van Buren of New York, the Little Magician, a national network of newspapers, committees, and local clubs was established. This was the birth of the modern political machine. They crafted a simple, powerful, and deeply emotional narrative. The election was a contest between the people, represented by Old Hickory, and the aristocracy, embodied by the cold, aloof Adams and the scheming Clay. Hickory poles were erected in town squares across the country. Parades, barbecues, and rallies became the staples of a new, boisterous campaign style that took politics out of the hands of the elite and brought it directly to the masses. The Jacksonian press, led by fiery editors like Duff Green and Amos Kendall, was relentless. They painted Adams as a decadent European-style monarchist, a man who had allegedly used public funds to purchase a billiard table and a set of chessmen for the White House, symbols of aristocratic indolence that were anathema to the common man. They accused him of being a pimp for the Tsar while serving as a diplomat in Russia. No accusation was too outlandish, no slander too base. The goal was to create an emotional caricature of Adams as everything the Jacksonians were not, out of touch, elitist, and fundamentally un-American. At the same time, they polished the legend of Jackson. He was Old Hickory, the farmer soldier, the hero of New Orleans, a man of action and iron will who would sweep the corrupt money changers from the temple of government. His military exploits were recounted in heroic detail, while his rough edges were smoothed into virtues of authenticity. His duels were not signs of a violent temper, but defenses of his honor. His lack of formal education was not a deficiency, but proof that he was a man of natural genius, uncorrupted by effete intellectualism. The Adams camp, fighting under the banner of the National Republicans, was aghast at these new tactics, but was soon forced to descend into the mud itself. They fought back with a savagery that matched and at times exceeded that of the Jacksonians. They attacked Jackson as a bloodthirsty butcher, a man with a volcanic temper who was wholly unfit for the presidency. They published the coffin handbills, stark pamphlets that listed by name the militia members Jackson had ordered executed for desertion. During the Creek War, each name framed by a grim, black coffin, they portrayed him as an adulterer and a homewrecker, dredging up the complicated circumstances of his marriage to Rachel. Years earlier, Rachel had married Jackson, believing her divorce from her first husband, Lewis Roberts, was final. It was not. When the error was discovered, they quietly remarried. But the technicality provided a devastating weapon for Jackson's enemies. They branded Rachel a bigamist and an adulteress, painting her as a woman of loose morals. This attack was the one that cut Jackson the deepest. He revered Rachel. Their love was the emotional anchor of his turbulent life. To see her name dragged through the public square, to see her tormented by the slanders of his political enemies, filled him with a rage that was almost biblical in its intensity. He saw it as the ultimate violation, the act of craven cowards, who could not face him on a field of honor and so chose to attack his beloved wife instead. He vowed to destroy them, but the damage was already done. Rachel, a gentle and pious woman who was terrified of public life, grew increasingly frail and depressed under the weight of the vicious public scrutiny. As election day approached in the fall of 1828, the nation was at a fever pitch. In many states, property qualifications for voting had been eliminated, leading to a massive expansion of the electorate. These new voters, the very common men Jackson claimed to represent, flocked to the polls in unprecedented numbers. The result was a landslide, an electoral earthquake. Jackson won in a rout, capturing 178 electoral votes to Adams's 83. It was a resounding repudiation of the Adams administration and the corrupt bargain. It was a triumph for the people, but for Andrew Jackson, the victory was drenched in sorrow. Amid the celebrations, Rachel collapsed, likely from a massive heart attack. She died on December 22, 1828. Jackson was inconsolable, his heart shattered. He remained by her side for hours, his head on her chest, refusing to believe she was gone. At her funeral, he looked at the crowd of mourners and said, with cold, chilling fury, "May God Almighty forgive her murderers, as I know she forgave them. I never can." He blamed her death squarely on the political attacks of his enemies. He would now go to Washington not as a triumphant victor, but as a grieving widower. A man whose greatest personal triumph was inextricably linked to his most profound personal tragedy. The people had their president, but he was a man carrying a broken heart and a burning desire for retribution. Chapter 10, Jackson in the White House, A New Style of Leadership, March 4, 1829. A raw, damp wind swept through Washington, but it could not chill the feverish excitement that gripped the Capitol. This was not just an inauguration, it was a coronation of the common man. A vast, unruly sea of humanity surged toward the Capitol building, farmers in homespun cloth, artisans with calloused hands, grizzled backwoodsmen in buckskin, all mingling with city dwellers and political hopefuls. They had come from every corner of the nation to witness the ascension of their hero, Andrew Jackson. He stood before them on the east portico, a tall, gaunt figure draped in black, still in deep mourning for his beloved Rachel. His face was a mask of grief, yet his presence was electric. When he spoke, his voice, though weakened by age and illness, carried a strength that resonated with the crowd. He was one of them, and his victory was their victory. After the ceremony, what followed was a scene that would be seared into the memory and nightmares of the Washington establishment. Traditionally, the new president held a polite reception at the White House, but this was the people's president, and the people decided to attend. The throng followed Jackson from the Capitol, converging on the executive mansion. They poured through the doors and windows, a muddy, boisterous mob, clambering onto satin-covered chairs with their dirty boots to get a glimpse of their champion. They jostled for refreshments, spilling barrels of orange punch, shattering thousands of dollars worth of china and crystal, and getting into fistfights. The sheer press of bodies became so dangerous that Jackson himself, looking pale and frail, was nearly crushed. Aides had to whisk him away, and he escaped through a back window. The staff, in a desperate stroke of genius, moved washtubs filled with whiskey and ice cream out onto the White House lawn, luring the ravenous crowd outside. The inaugural brawl, as it came to be known, was a moment of profound symbolism. To the old guard, like Supreme Court Justice Joseph Story, it was a terrifying spectacle. The reign of King Mob seemed triumphant, but to Jackson's supporters, it was a glorious baptism. The people's house had finally been claimed by the people. This chaotic beginning was a harbinger of the presidency to come. Jackson's style of leadership was a radical departure from his predecessors. He viewed the presidency not as a mere administrative office, but as the direct embodiment of the popular will. He was In his mind, the only official elected by all the people, and he wielded that mandate like a weapon. He held a deep suspicion of the formal structures of government, which he believed were populated by a self-serving aristocracy. His official cabinet was largely a collection of political appointments, some of whom he barely trusted. His vice president, John C. Calhoun, was a brilliant but ambitious rival whom Jackson would come to loathe. Instead of relying on this formal body, Jackson turned to an informal group of trusted friends and advisors, a circle his detractors contemptuously dubbed the Kitchen Cabinet. This group included men like Martin Van Buren, who eventually became Secretary of State, newspaper editors Amos Kendall and Francis Preston Blair, and his old friend William Berkeley Lewis. They met with the president in private, often late at night in the White House, offering counsel, drafting speeches, and helping to formulate policy. They were his loyalists, his confidants, men who understood his populist vision and his visceral political instincts. This method of governance was infuriating to his opponents. They saw it as secretive, unaccountable, and a flagrant disregard for constitutional norms, but for Jackson, it was simple common sense. He trusted loyalty and personal relationships over formal titles and institutional procedure. He was governing like a general, relying on his trusted staff to carry out his orders. His personal style was just as revolutionary. He dispensed with the stiff, formal etiquette of past administrations. He was accessible, at least to those he considered friends of the people. He would often be seen smoking his pipe on the White House portico, and he opened the mansion to the public at designated times, shaking hands with anyone who cared to visit. Yet beneath this folksy demeanor was that unbending iron will. He was a man of fierce loyalties and even fiercer hatreds. To cross Andrew Jackson was to make an enemy for life. He saw the political world in stark, moral terms. You were either with him or against him. Policy debates were not abstract discussions. They were personal battles between the forces of good the people and evil the corrupt elites. This intensely personal, emotional approach to the presidency electrified his supporters, who saw it as authentic and decisive. It terrified his enemies, who saw it as the behavior of a despot, a King Andrew I who placed his own will above the law and the Constitution. The White House, once a bastion of genteel, aristocratic governance, had been transformed into the command center of a populist revolution led by a grieving, vengeful, and utterly determined president. Chapter 11, The Spoils System. Rewarding loyalty. In the wake of the inaugural brawl, a palpable sense of dread settled over the permanent bureaucracy of Washington. The civil servants, clerks, and postmasters who populated the federal government, many of whom had held their positions for decades, serving under multiple administrations, now felt the ground shifting beneath their feet. Andrew Jackson had not just campaigned against the aristocracy of Adams and Clay. He had railed against the very idea of a permanent, entrenched class of government officials. In his first annual message to Congress, he laid out his philosophy with chilling clarity. The duties of all public officers are so plain and simple that men of intelligence may readily qualify themselves for their performance. He argued that long tenure in office inevitably led to corruption and a sense of entitlement. A rotation in office, he declared, was a core principle of democracy, preventing the government from becoming a self-serving bureaucracy, distant from the people it was meant to serve. This philosophy was the public justification for what would become one of the most controversial and defining features of his presidency, the spoils system. The phrase itself was coined by New York Senator William L. Marcy, who, in defending the practice, starkly proclaimed, "To the victor belong the spoils of the enemy." For Jackson and his supporters, this was not a cynical power grab, it was a moral and democratic necessity. They had fought a war against the corrupt establishment and won. Now it was time to cleanse the temple. The government, they believed, should be staffed by those who were loyal to the president and his populist mandate. To leave the machinery of government in the hands of one's political enemies was not only foolish but a betrayal of the people's will. The election, in their view, was not just a choice of a leader but a complete house cleaning. The purge began almost immediately. One by one, Office holders associated with the Adams administration, many of them competent and experienced. Public servants received terse letters of dismissal. The emotional toll was immense. For many, a federal post was not just a job, it was a life's work, a source of status and security. Men who had served the Republic for 20 or 30 years suddenly found themselves cast out, their careers destroyed, their families facing destitution. Newspapers were filled with their desperate, pleading letters. One elderly clerk, it was said, collapsed and died upon receiving his dismissal notice. Another, financially ruined and publicly humiliated, took his own life. The opponents of Jackson seized upon these stories, painting him as a heartless tyrant, a revolutionary leader rewarding his cronies with the plunder of the state. In reality, the Jacksonian rotation was less sweeping than its critics claimed. Over his 8 years in office, Jackson removed only about 10 to 20% of federal office holders. However, the psychological impact was profound. He had shattered the old assumption of permanence. No government job was safe. Loyalty to the party in power, not necessarily competence or experience, became the paramount qualification for public service. The effect was to politicize the federal workforce in a way it had never been before. The system was a double-edged sword. On one hand, it was undeniably a democratizing force. It broke the monopoly of the educated, coastal elite on federal jobs and opened up opportunities for men from a wider range of backgrounds and geographic locations. It made the government more responsive to the political currents of the day and cemented the role of the political party as the central organizing force in American public life. It was the engine of the new Democratic Party machine, rewarding the foot soldiers, the editors, the organizers, the local leaders who had worked tirelessly to bring Old Hickory to power. A postmastership in a small town or a clerkship in the Treasury Department was a tangible reward for political faith, ensuring that the party would have a loyal and motivated base for the next election. On the other hand, the emotional and practical costs were staggering. The system often rewarded incompetence and cronyism over merit. The most famous example was the appointment of Samuel Swartwout as the collector of the Port of New York, a loyal but notoriously profligate Jackson supporter. Swartwout proceeded to embezzle over $1 million, an astronomical sum at the time, before fleeing to Europe. The scandal was a profound embarrassment and seemed to confirm the worst fears of Jackson's critics, that the spoils system was simply a recipe for corruption on a grand scale. It created a climate of anxiety and sycophancy where officials were more concerned with pleasing their political patrons than with serving the public good. It was a system born of Jackson's intensely personal view of politics, a world of loyal friends and hated enemies. It was an act of both revolution and revenge, an attempt to make the government an instrument of his will, but in doing so, it infused American politics with a partisan bitterness and a culture of patronage that would endure for generations. Chapter 12, War on the Bank, destroying financial elites. In the mind of Andrew Jackson, the Second Bank of the United States was not merely a financial institution, it was a living, breathing monster. He saw it coiled around the heart of the Republic, its scaly hide impenetrable, its many heads representing the privileged few, the wealthy merchants of the East, the powerful politicians in its pocket, the arrogant foreign investors who held its stock. It was, to him, a hydra of corruption, and he, as the people's champion, was the modern-day Hercules sent to slay it. This was not a matter of fiscal policy. It was a holy war for the soul of America, a deeply personal and emotional crusade that would define his presidency and send shockwaves through the nation's economic foundations. The air in Washington was thick with the coming storm, a clash not just of ideas, but of two Americas and two men who embodied them. At the head of this formidable beast sat Nicholas Biddle, a man as different from Jackson as one could imagine. Where Jackson was raw-boned, weathered, and powered by instinct and righteous fury, Biddle was polished, urbane, and supremely confident in his intellect. A Philadelphia aristocrat, a poet, and a scholar, Biddle had taken the helm of the bank in 1823 and guided it with a steady, masterful hand. He saw the bank as a force for stability, its vast power used to regulate the volatile state banks, to control credit and currency, and to foster a stable environment for economic growth. To the nation's burgeoning business class, Biddle was a financial genius, a patriot ensuring the country's prosperity. But to Jackson, every act of the bank's power was an affront to liberty. When it tightened credit, it strangled the farmer seeking a loan. When it expanded its influence, it bribed the press and purchased congressmen. Jackson, who had once nearly been ruined by land speculation and paper money, harbored a deep, visceral distrust of all banks, and this national, government-sanctioned Goliath was the most dangerous of all. The opening salvos of the war were fired in Jackson's first message to Congress in 1829, with a stunning directness that sent tremors through the financial world. He questioned both the bank's constitutionality and its expediency. The declaration was an open challenge. Biddle, initially dismissive of the old Hickory's frontier prejudices, was prodded into action by Jackson's political rivals Henry Clay and Daniel Webster. They saw in the bank a perfect political weapon. Believing Jackson would not dare to act against the bank in an election year, they devised a plan. They would push for the bank's charter to be renewed in 1832, for years ahead of schedule. If Jackson signed the bill, he would alienate his Western supporters who despised the bank. If he vetoed it, they were certain he would lose the support of the powerful Eastern states, handing them the presidency. It was a political trap, and Biddle, overconfident, walked right into it, formally applying for recharter. The bill's passage through Congress was a spectacle of the very power Jackson decried. The bank's funds were liberally used to persuade editors and politicians, and the measure passed with comfortable margins. The bill landed on the president's desk in July 1832. Washington held its breath. The nation waited. Jackson, ill and confined to his bed for part of this period, saw the move not as a legislative maneuver but as a personal attack, a direct challenge to his authority and his vision. He gathered his kitchen cabinet, his trusted circle of informal advisors, and with their help, he crafted his response. It would be no mere legalistic rejection. It would be a populist manifesto, a roar of defiance that would echo from the frontier cabins of Tennessee to the factories of New England. The veto message, when it came, was a thunderclap. It was one of the most powerful and consequential documents in American presidential history. Jackson declared with searing emotion that the bank was an unconstitutional monopoly, a vehicle for enriching the wealthy at the expense of the poor. It is to be regretted that the rich and powerful too often bend the acts of government to their selfish purposes, he wrote, his words burning with class resentment. He attacked the foreign ownership of bank stock, painting a picture of American destiny being sold to British aristocrats. He dismissed the Supreme Court's earlier ruling in McCulloch v. Maryland that had affirmed the bank's constitutionality, arguing that the president, too, had a right to interpret the Constitution as he saw fit. He was pitting the will of the people, as embodied in their president, against the power of the Congress and the court. He ended with a call to arms, casting the upcoming election as a referendum on the bank. I have now done my duty to my country, he declared. The fate of the monster was now in the hands of the people. The war had just begun. Chapter 13, Nullification Crisis, Union versus States' Rights. The fire of the bank war had not yet cooled when a new, more terrifying blaze erupted, threatening to consume the nation itself. This was not a war over money and class, but over the very nature of the American experiment. It was a crisis that pitted state against federal government, friend against friend, and, most dramatically, the president against his own vice president. The nullification crisis of 1832-33 was a constitutional powder keg, a moment of profound and agonizing tension when the fragile bonds of the United States stretched to their breaking point, and the specter of disunion and civil war cast a long, dark shadow over the land. At the center of this maelstrom stood Andrew Jackson, no longer just the champion of the common man but the ferocious, unyielding defender of the Federal Union. The conflict was rooted in the soil and soul of the South, particularly in South Carolina. For years, the state's planter aristocracy had seethed under a series of federal tariffs, taxes on imported goods designed to protect the burgeoning industries of the North. To the Southerners who exported cotton to a world market and imported their manufactured goods, these tariffs were nothing short of economic warfare. The Tariff of 1828, decried throughout the South as the Tariff of Abominations, brought this simmering resentment to a boil. It felt like a punishment, a transfer of wealth from the agricultural South to the industrial North, imposed by a tyrannical federal majority. The palmetto-lined streets of Charleston buzzed with angry whispers, and a profound sense of victimhood and defiance took hold. They felt their way of life, built on agriculture and slavery, was under assault. Out of this atmosphere of outrage stepped the crisis's intellectual architect, John C. Calhoun. He was a political titan, a man of fierce intelligence and rigid principles, and he was Andrew Jackson's vice president. In a secret, anonymously published essay, Calhoun resurrected the doctrine of nullification. The theory was elegant and explosive. He argued that the Union was a compact of sovereign states, and any state, therefore, had the right to nullify, or declare void within its borders, any federal law it deemed unconstitutional. It was a radical interpretation of states' rights, a dagger aimed at the heart of federal authority. For Calhoun, it was the only peaceful way for a minority, the South, to protect itself from the tyranny of the majority, the North. For Jackson, it was treason. The personal and political rupture between Jackson and Calhoun was seismic. Jackson, the ardent nationalist who had fought and bled to create and defend the United States, viewed nullification as an unforgivable betrayal. The tension between the two men became the stuff of Washington legend, culminating in a dramatic moment at a Jefferson Day dinner in April 1830. The nullifiers had planned to use the event to test the political waters. After a series of toasts praising states' rights, President Jackson rose, stared directly at Calhoun, and delivered his own thunderous toast. "Our federal union, it must be preserved." The room fell silent. Calhoun, trembling with emotion, followed with his own desperate counter, "The Union, next to our liberty, the most dear." The battle lines were drawn. There was no middle ground. In November 1832, emboldened by Calhoun's theory, South Carolina threw down the gauntlet. A state convention formally adopted an ordinance of nullification, declaring the tariffs of 1828 and 1830 to null and void within the state. They threatened secession if the federal government attempted to use force to collect the duties. The nation held its breath. This was no longer a theoretical debate. Jackson's response was swift and incandescent with rage. Disunion by armed forces treason. He privately fumed. Publicly, he issued his proclamation to the people of South Carolina, a powerful and eloquent defense of the Union. He appealed to their patriotism, reasoned with them on constitutional grounds, but also delivered a chilling, fatherly warning. "The dictates of a high duty oblige me solemnly to announce that you cannot succeed. Be not deceived by names. Disunion by armed forces treason. Are you really ready to incur its guilt?" Behind the scenes, he prepared for the worst. He reinforced federal forts in Charleston, readied the army, and asked Congress for a force bill to authorize the use of the military to enforce the law. The country teetered on the edge of a precipice. The thought of American soldiers firing on American citizens, which would become a horrific reality 3 decades later, was suddenly a terrifying possibility. Yet, even as he sharpened his sword, Jackson supported a compromise. Henry Clay, the great compromiser who had been Jackson's foe in the Bank War, now became an unlikely ally for peace. Clay forged a new tariff bill that would gradually lower the duties over a decade. It was a face-saving measure for both sides. Congress passed both the compromise tariff and the force bill on the same day. South Carolina, isolated and faced with Jackson's iron resolve, accepted the compromise and repealed its ordinance of nullification, though in a final, petulant act of defiance, it nullified the now unnecessary force bill. The immediate crisis was over, but the relief was tinged with a deep, unsettling sorrow. The fundamental questions of sovereignty, states' rights, and secession had not been answered. The conflict had merely been postponed, and the echoes of Jackson's fury and Calhoun's defiance would reverberate through the years, a prelude to a far more terrible war to come. Chapter 14, Indian Removal, Expansion at a Terrible Cost. There is a chapter in the story of Andrew Jackson and of America that is read with a bowed head and a heavy heart. It is a story not of glorious battle or high constitutional drama, but of a calculated, cold-blooded policy that inflicted immeasurable suffering and stands as a permanent stain on the nation's honor. This is the story of Indian removal, a policy born of avarice, cloaked in the language of paternalism and executed with a ruthless efficiency that belied its devastating human cost. While Jackson battled the bank and the nullifiers, he was simultaneously waging a different kind of war, a war against the original inhabitants of the land, driven by a vision of a white, agrarian empire and a profound, unyielding belief in the racial inferiority of Native Americans. It was a policy that would culminate in a trail of tears, but its origins lay in a deep, dark well of national greed and presidential resolve. For decades, the 5 civilized tribes, the Cherokee, Chickasaw, Choctaw, Creek, and Seminole had lived on their ancestral lands in the southeastern United States. They were not the savage nomads of frontier propaganda. They had, in an extraordinary effort to coexist, adopted many of the ways of their white neighbors. The Cherokee, in particular, had created a remarkable society. They developed a written language, thanks to the genius of Sequoyah. They drafted a constitution modeled on that of the United States, established a bicameral legislature, and created a judicial system. They lived in log cabins, cultivated farms, and ran grist mills. They had done everything America had asked of them, embracing civilization in the hopes of securing their place in the nation. Their success, however, did not inspire respect, it inspired envy. The insatiable hunger for land in the deep South was a fever that no treaty could quell. The Cotton Kingdom was booming, and the fertile lands occupied by the tribes were seen as an obstacle to progress and profit. States like Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi grew increasingly aggressive, passing laws that extended their jurisdiction over the sovereign tribal nations, annulling their laws and opening their lands to white settlement. It was a legal and physical assault, designed to make life so intolerable that the tribes would have no choice but to leave. They appealed to the federal government, their treaty partner, their supposed protector. They appealed to the Great Father in Washington, Andrew Jackson. They would find no sympathy there. Jackson's views on Native Americans were complex, but the outcome was tragically simple. He was a man of the frontier, a veteran of brutal wars against the Creeks and Seminoles, and he carried the prejudices of his time and place. He did not believe that whites and Indians could live together. In his mind, the tribes were children incapable of self-government who stood in the path of destiny. He couched his desire for their lands in the language of salvation. Removal, he argued, was not an act of cruelty but of kindness. It was the only way to save them from the corrupting influence of the states and the depredations of white settlers by moving them west of the Mississippi River to a permanent Indian territory. He claimed he was protecting them from extinction, giving them a chance to survive and pursue their own happiness. It was a grotesque and self-serving justification, a paternalistic mask for a policy of ethnic cleansing. In 1830, Jackson made removal the central legislative priority of his administration. He threw the full weight of his immense popularity and political power behind the passage of the Indian Removal Act. The debate that followed was one of the most passionate and morally charged in the history of Congress. Men like Senator Theodore Frelinghuysen of New Jersey and Congressman Davy Crockett of Tennessee, a fellow frontiersman, made eloquent, heart-wrenching pleas on behalf of the tribes. They spoke of broken treaties, of national honor, and of the gross injustice of driving a peaceful people from their homes. Frelinghuysen's 6-hour speech was a masterpiece of moral outrage, pleading with his colleagues not to stain the fair fame of our country. But the forces of expansion, fueled by the president's will, were too strong. The bill passed by the narrowest of margins, a testament to the deep division it caused. Jackson signed the Indian Removal Act into law on May 28, 1830. The sound of the pen scratching on the parchment was a death knell for the hopes of the 5 tribes. The legal framework for their dispossession was now in place. The cost of this expansion, a cost to be paid in lives, in culture, and in spirit, was now to be exacted. Chapter 15. The Trail of Tears, a dark chapter in power. The Indian Removal Act was not just a law, it was a sentence. The years that followed its passage were a slow, agonizing descent into one of the most shameful episodes in American history. The Trail of Tears, as it came to be known, is a name that fails to capture the full scope of the horror. It was not one trail, but many. It was not a journey of sorrow, but a forced death march. It was the brutal, physical manifestation of Jackson's iron will. A dark chapter written not with ink, but with the frozen tears and lonely graves of thousands of men, women, and children. This was the consequence of power untempered by mercy, the final, tragic fulfillment of a promise of removal that had been a lie from its very inception. The air on these trails was not filled with the hope of a new beginning, but with the suffocating dust of despair and the chilling quiet of death. The Choctaw were the first to go. In the bitter winter of 1831, they signed a removal treaty under extreme duress, and their exodus was a chaotic and horrific preview of what was to come. Undersupplied by corrupt contractors, ravaged by an unexpected blizzard and a cholera epidemic, they staggered west. A newspaper reporter, witnessing a group of starving, freezing Choctaw huddled on the banks of the Arkansas River, described their trek as a trail of tears and death. The name would stick, a haunting epitaph for the policy. Thousands perished, their bodies left in unmarked graves along the muddy roads and frozen river banks, a silent testament to the terrible cost of progress. The Creeks followed, driven from their lands after a desperate, futile resistance, shackled in irons and marched away from the smoldering ruins of their homes. But it was the fate of the Cherokee Nation that seared itself most deeply into the nation's conscience. They had resisted not with weapons, but with the white man's own laws. They took their case to the Supreme Court, and in a stunning decision, Worcester v. Georgia 1832, Chief Justice John Marshall ruled in their favor. He affirmed that the Cherokee Nation was a sovereign political community and that the laws of Georgia had no force within its territory. The Cherokee rejoiced. They had won. Their faith in American justice, it seemed, was vindicated, but their victory was hollow. Upon hearing the news, President Jackson reportedly scoffed. "John Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it." Whether he actually spoke these exact words is debated, but his actions were clear. He had no intention of using federal power to protect the Cherokee from the state of Georgia. He had the will of the people, the white, land-hungry voters behind him, and that was a higher law than any court decision. With their legal options exhausted and the federal government refusing to help, the Cherokee Nation was torn apart. A small, unauthorized faction, believing further resistance was futile, signed the Treaty of New Echota in 1835, ceding all remaining Cherokee lands for a sum of money and territory in the West. The vast majority of the Cherokee people, led by their steadfast principal Chief John Ross, did not accept the treaty. They considered it a fraud, signed by men who had no authority to speak for them. Over 15,000 Cherokee signed petitions protesting the treaty, but Congress ratified it by a single vote. The sentence was now final. In the spring of 1838, under the orders of Jackson's hand-picked successor, Martin Van Buren, the U.S. Army moved in. General Winfield Scott commanded 7,000 troops to begin the roundup. The soldiers swept through the Cherokee homeland in Georgia, North Carolina, and Tennessee. Families were dragged from their homes at bayonet point, sometimes with food still warm on the table. They were forced into filthy, overcrowded stockades and internment camps, where disease, measles, whooping cough, dysentery ran rampant, claiming hundreds of lives before the journey even began. That fall, the long march west started. Huddled together against the biting wind and driving snow, more than 16,000 Cherokee began the 1,000-mile trek. They had few blankets and insufficient food. The elderly and the very young were the first to succumb. The journey became a relentless funeral procession. Day after day, the survivors would dig shallow graves in the frozen earth to bury their loved ones. A child lost to fever, a grandmother whose heart simply gave out. A quarter of the Cherokee Nation, more than 4,000 people, perished in the stockades or along the trail. They died of cold, of sickness, of starvation, and of simple, soul-crushing heartbreak. They had lost their homes, their land, their ancestors' graves, and their faith in the promise of justice. This was the dark, unassailable truth of Andrew Jackson's power, a legacy of empty plains and full graveyards. Chapter 16, Enemies Everywhere, Assassination Attempts and Betrayals. Andrew Jackson's world was a battlefield. He saw life as a series of conflicts, a struggle between the virtuous common man and the corrupt forces of privilege and conspiracy. This worldview was not merely political, it was intensely personal, etched into his soul by a life of hardship, duels, and frontier warfare. During his presidency, this mentality intensified, creating a political atmosphere so charged with animosity that it felt as if the White House itself was under siege. Jackson saw enemies not just in the halls of Congress or the boardrooms of the bank, but lurking in the shadows, in the whispers of society gossip, and even behind the faces of his own cabinet. This pervasive sense of being surrounded by treachery fueled his righteous anger and drove his political actions, transforming policy disputes into personal vendettas and culminating in the first ever attempt on the life of a U.S. president. The chilling moment came on a frigid January day in 1835. Jackson was attending a memorial service for a congressman in the Capitol building. As he emerged from the House chamber into the rotunda, a man stepped from the crowd, raised a pistol just a few feet from the president's chest and pulled the trigger. A loud pop, but no shot. The percussion cap had exploded, but the powder had failed to ignite. In an instant, the would-be assassin, an unemployed house painter named Richard Lawrence, produced a second pistol and aimed it. He pulled the trigger again, and again, miraculously, the cap exploded, but the gun misfired. The odds of two separate, properly loaded pistols misfiring in a row were astronomical. The 67-year-old Jackson, never a man to retreat, was incandescent with fury. He charged at Lawrence, raising his walking cane to strike him down, and had to be restrained by those around him, including Congressman Davy Crockett, as the assailant was subdued. For Jackson, this was no random act of a madman. His mind, conditioned to see conspiracy, immediately connected the dots to his political foes. The bank. He roared, convinced that his great enemy, the Second Bank of the United States, was behind the attempt. He saw the hand of his political nemesis, Senator George Poindexter of Mississippi, whom he publicly accused of hiring Lawrence, while investigations later proved Lawrence was mentally unstable and acted alone, convinced he was the heir to the British throne, and that Jackson was preventing him from claiming his inheritance. The president never relinquished his belief that he was the target of a vast political conspiracy. The event confirmed his deepest fears. His enemies were not content to fight him. With bills and speeches, they wanted him dead. It solidified his conviction that he was engaged in a life or death struggle for the future of the Republic. This sense of betrayal was not confined to grand, violent events. It poisoned his administration from its very beginning through a bizarre and destructive social scandal known as the Petticoat Affair or the Eaton Affair. The controversy centered on Peggy Eaton, the vivacious and intelligent wife of Jackson's close friend and Secretary of War, John Eaton. Peggy's reputation was clouded by rumors that her relationship with Eaton had begun, while her first husband was still alive. The other cabinet wives, led by Fluoride Calhoun, the vice president's wife, refused to socialize with her. They snubbed her at parties, refused her visits, and treated her as a social pariah. To an outsider, it was high society gossip. To Jackson, it was a deeply personal and political attack. The situation painfully reminded him of the vicious slanders that had been directed at his own beloved late wife, Rachel, during the 1828 campaign. His political enemies had dredged up the complex circumstances of Rachel's divorce from her first husband, branding her an adulteress and a bigamist. Jackson believed these relentless, cruel attacks had broken her spirit and hastened her death just weeks after his election victory. He carried this wound with a burning, unquenchable grief. Now, seeing Peggy Eaton subjected to similar persecution, he saw the same venom, the same conspiracy. He saw the hand of his political rivals, particularly Henry Clay, and a growing suspicion fell upon John C. Calhoun, using his wife to undermine the administration. Jackson's defense of Peggy Eaton was absolute and volcanic. He called cabinet meetings not to discuss policy, but to demand that his secretaries and their wives treat Mrs. Eaton with respect. He declared her as chaste as a virgin. The affair paralyzed the government. The refusal of the cabinet members to bend to his will was, in his eyes, an act of insubordination and betrayal. The social schism became an unbridgeable political chasm. Ultimately, to break the impasse, Jackson orchestrated a full-scale reorganization of his government in 1831. He forced the entire cabinet to resign, allowing him to purge the Calhoun loyalists and build a new cabinet based on absolute personal loyalty. The Petticoat Affair shattered the Jackson-Calhoun alliance beyond repair, pushing the vice president firmly into the opposition, and setting the stage for the epic confrontation of the Nullification crisis. It was a stunning demonstration of how, for Andrew Jackson, the personal was always political, and a perceived slight could ignite a fire that threatened to consume the entire administration. Chapter 17, Forged in Fire, From Orphan to Old Hickory. The man who would one day bend the American presidency to his will was born from nothing. In the wild, bleeding borderlands of the Carolinas in 1767, there was no family fortune to inherit, no political dynasty to guide his path. There was only the harsh scrubland, the constant threat of violence, and the raw, untamed spirit of the frontier. Andrew Jackson's first inheritance was a loss. His father died just before he was born, leaving his mother, Elizabeth, to raise 3 boys in a world of profound hardship. The revolution, when it came, was not a distant political debate for young Andrew. It was a home invasion, a visceral inferno that consumed his entire world. It swept through the Waxhaw settlement like a plague, and at the tender age of 13, Jackson and his brother Robert joined the local militia not as polished soldiers, but as boy guerrillas in a brutal civil war that pitted neighbor against neighbor. The fire that forged him was lit in a moment of agonizing humiliation. Captured by British dragoons, the defiant boy was ordered to clean a cavalry officer's muddy boots. When Andrew refused, citing his rights as a prisoner of war, the officer's face contorted with rage. A sword was drawn not in the heat of battle, but in a cold flash of aristocratic fury against a colonial upstart. Jackson threw up his hand to parry the blow, but the blade was too quick. It sliced open his palm and gashed his forehead, leaving him with 2 permanent scars, one on his skin, the other on his soul. That searing pain, that righteous indignation at the abuse of power would become the central, animating force of his life. He would never again bow to an authority he deemed illegitimate. The experience was compounded by tragedy. He and his brother contracted smallpox in the squalor of the British prison. They were eventually released in a prisoner exchange secured by their desperate mother. But Robert died days later. In a final, crushing blow, Elizabeth herself would perish from cholera while nursing American prisoners of war, leaving Andrew, a complete orphan at 14, alone in a world that had taken everything from him. That solitary, scarred boy grew into a man of terrifying intensity. He moved west to Tennessee, a land as wild and ambitious as he was. He became a lawyer, a prosecutor, and a judge, but his brand of justice was often delivered not in a courtroom, but on the dueling ground. His face, already marked by the British sword, became a roadmap of violent encounters. He was a man of absolute loyalties and unforgiving hatreds. An insult to his honor, or more perilously, to the honor of his beloved wife, Rachel, was a debt that could only be paid in blood. His marriage to Rachel Donaldson Roberts, a woman of deep piety and gentle spirit, was the emotional anchor of his tumultuous life. But their union was shadowed by the scandal of her first marriage, a complex affair that provided endless ammunition for his political enemies. Jackson saw the whispers and accusations against Rachel not as political maneuvering, but as a profound moral stain, an assault by the corrupt elite on the one pure thing in his life. He carried that protective fury like a shield, and it hardened his heart against anyone who dared to cross him. But it was in the War of 1812 that the frontier lawyer was fully transformed into a national icon. As a general in the Tennessee militia, he was unyielding, demanding absolute discipline from his men while sharing in all their hardships. He earned his moniker, Old Hickory, when he refused orders to disband his army far from home, instead marching them hundreds of miles back to Tennessee. His personal resolve was tough and unbending as the wood of a hickory tree. He waged a brutal and effective campaign against the Red Stick Creek Nation, culminating in the slaughter at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend, an act that secured vast new territories for the United States, but also demonstrated his utter ruthlessness. The apex of his military career, the moment that seared his image into the American imagination, was the Battle of New Orleans in 1815. There, against all odds, his patchwork army of militia, frontiersmen, free men of color, and even pirates decimated a superior force of British regulars. The battle was fought, ironically, after the peace treaty had been signed. But in an age of slow communication, it was the news of this stunning victory that electrified the nation. It was a moment of pure, unadulterated triumph, of vindication, of the common man's ability to defend his own land. Andrew Jackson, the orphan scarred by a British sword, had finally had his revenge. He was no longer just a man. He was a symbol, a living legend, the embodiment of American grit and defiance. Chapter 18, Executive Power Expanded, Redefining the Presidency. The scene on March 4, 1829, was one of unprecedented pandemonium, a democratic flood tide crashing against the shores of staid Washington society. Andrew Jackson, the people's president, had arrived. Following a brief and somber ceremony at the Capitol, a throng of thousands, farmers in muddy boots, clerks in worn-out coats, artisans with calloused hands, surged towards the White House. They poured into the executive mansion, clambering over satin furniture in pursuit of their hero, spilling whiskey on fine carpets, and shattering glassware in their unbridled enthusiasm. To the old guard, like the departing John Quincy Adams, it was a horrifying spectacle, the reign of king. Mob. To Jackson and his followers, it was a coronation, a beautiful, chaotic baptism for a new era of American politics. The presidency, once a remote office occupied by a line of Virginia gentry and New England aristocrats, had been seized by the people themselves, and its power would now be wielded as their instrument. Jackson's first and most dramatic act was to cleanse the government of what he saw as a corrupt and entrenched bureaucracy. He initiated the spoils system, a policy of sweeping out incumbent office holders and replacing them with loyal supporters. His motto, "To the victor belong the spoils," sent a shockwave through the Capitol. His critics decried it as a naked power grab, a cheapening of public service that replaced competence with cronyism. But Jackson defended it with a passionate, emotional appeal to democratic principle. Government was not, he argued, a mysterious art known only to a privileged few. Its duties were so plain and simple that men of intelligence may readily qualify themselves for their performance. He believed that rotation in office was a fundamental good, preventing the emergence of a permanent, unaccountable ruling class and ensuring that the government remained responsive to the will of the electorate. It was a deeply personal crusade. He saw the established clerks and officials as the same sort of privileged insiders who had slandered his wife Rachel, whose death after the brutal 1828 campaign he blamed squarely on their venomous tongues. Every dismissal was, in his mind, a small act of justice for her. Beyond personnel, Jackson fundamentally redefined the president's relationship with the other branches of government. He did not view himself as a mere administrator of laws passed by Congress. He saw himself as the direct representative of the American people, the only official elected by the entire nation, and he therefore possessed a mandate that superseded that of any individual congressman or senator. This belief was most powerfully expressed through his use of the presidential veto. Previous presidents had used the veto sparingly, and almost exclusively on grounds of a bill's unconstitutionality. Jackson wielded it like a weapon. He vetoed more bills than all 6 of his predecessors combined, and he did so often on grounds of simple policy disagreement. He believed that if a bill passed by Congress was not, in his judgment, in the best interest of the people, he had not just a right but a solemn duty to strike it down. His most famous early veto of the Maysville Road Bill, which would have funded a road entirely within the state of Kentucky, was a declaration of war against what he called the corrupt bargain of federally funded internal improvements that he believed disproportionately benefited the well-connected at the expense of the ordinary taxpayer. It was a move that horrified his opponents, who saw it as an act of executive tyranny, a dangerous overreach that threatened the balance of power. But for millions of Americans, it was a thrilling demonstration of a president finally standing up to the special interests, a hero using his authority to protect the public purse and defend the common good. He was not just occupying the presidency, he was transforming it, infusing it with a power and a popular mandate it had never known before. Chapter 19, A Matter of Honor, the Petticoat Affair and the Politics of the Personal. The grand political battles of Jackson's first term, the spoils system, the vetoes. The war on internal improvements were fought in the open, on the floors of Congress and in the pages of partisan newspapers. But a far more intimate and emotionally charged war was being waged behind closed doors, in the perfumed drawing rooms and whispered corridors of Washington's elite social circles. This was the Petticoat Affair, or the Eaton malaria, a social scandal of such consuming intensity that it would ultimately shatter Jackson's cabinet and redefine his presidency. At its center was Peggy Eaton, the vivacious and intelligent wife of Jackson's close friend and Secretary of War, John Eaton. Peggy was the daughter of a tavern keeper, a woman of humble origins whose beauty and sharp wit had long made her the subject of salacious gossip. Rumors swirled that her relationship with John Eaton had begun while her first husband was still alive, and Washington's high society, led by the imperious Floride Calhoun, wife of Vice President John C. Calhoun, refused to accept her when Jackson appointed Eaton to his cabinet. The wives of the other cabinet members declared social war. They refused to call on Mrs. Eaton. They turned their backs on her at official functions. They walked out of the rooms she entered. These women, the gatekeepers of Washington's rigid social hierarchy, had rendered their verdict. Peggy Eaton was not a lady, and she would not be received. To another president, this might have been a trivial, if embarrassing, social nuisance. To Andrew Jackson, it was a declaration of war on the most sacred ground imaginable. In the ostracism of Peggy Eaton, he saw a horrifying and tragic echo of the very same social cruelty that had been directed at his own beloved wife, Rachel. For years, his political enemies had used the complex circumstances of their marriage to label Rachel an adulteress and a bigot. Jackson believed with every fiber of his being that the stress and humiliation of the vicious 1828 campaign had broken her health and led to her premature death. Just months before his inauguration, he had arrived in Washington a grieving, heartbroken man, convinced that the venomous tongues of the elite had murdered his wife. Now, he saw the same cabal, the same aristocratic vipers, attempting to destroy the wife of his trusted friend. His response was not one of cool political calculation, but of raw, unadulterated fury. "She is as chaste as a virgin," he thundered in defense of Peggy. He saw the attacks on her not as a social slight, but as a political conspiracy orchestrated by his ambitious vice president, Calhoun, to discredit Eaton and drive him from the cabinet, thereby strengthening Calhoun's own position as Jackson's heir apparent. The personal became profoundly political. Jackson called emergency cabinet meetings not to discuss tariffs or treaties, but to demand that his secretaries control their wives. He presented evidence and testimonials to the cabinet, like a prosecutor making a case, insisting on Peggy Eaton's virtue. He pleaded, He raged, he threatened. He told them that accepting Peggy was a test of their loyalty to him, and by extension, to the principles of his administration. The conflict was intractable. The cabinet secretaries could not, or would not, force their wives to socialize with a woman they despised. The machinery of government ground to a halt, paralyzed by a social feud. Finally, recognizing the impossibility of the situation, Secretary of State Martin Van Buren, a clever widower unencumbered by a socially ambitious wife, offered Jackson a brilliant solution. He and Eden would resign, allowing Jackson to request the resignations of the entire Calhoun-aligned cabinet and build a new one free from the social poison. Jackson seized the opportunity, purging his administration of Calhoun's allies and elevating the loyal Van Buren, cementing him as his new successor. The Petticoat affair was a bizarre and deeply emotional episode, but it revealed the very soul of Andrew Jackson's leadership, his fierce, almost primal loyalty, his tendency to view political opposition as a personal attack, and his unshakable conviction that a matter of private honor was worth more than any political convention. Chapter 20, the second term, Control, Conflict, and Consequences. Fresh from his landslide re-election in 1832, Andrew Jackson entered his second term not with an air of quiet consolidation, but with the righteous fury of a warrior embarking on his final, most critical crusades. The mandate from the people was, in his eyes, absolute. It was a command to vanquish the two great monsters that he believed threatened the very soul of the Republic, the Second Bank of the United States, and the insidious doctrine of nullification. The conflicts that ensued would push the nation to the brink, unleashing forces of such power and consequence that they would define the American political landscape for generations. His war against the bank was the central, defining passion of his presidency. He saw the Bank of the United States, a private corporation granted a federal charter, not as a stabilizing economic force, but as a hydra of corruption, a monstrous concentration of wealth and power that bent the government to its will. He despised its president, the suave and brilliant Nicholas Biddle, viewing him as the epitome of the arrogant, unaccountable aristocratic power he had fought his entire life. In his 1832 campaign, Jackson had vetoed the bill to recharter the bank, and his overwhelming victory was, to him, a public referendum on its destruction. Now, he resolved to kill the beast before its charter expired. Against the advice of many in his own cabinet, he ordered the removal of all federal deposits from the bank, placing them instead in a collection of state-chartered banks, derisively termed pet banks by his opponents. This was a breathtaking assertion of executive power. He had to fire two Treasury secretaries who refused to carry out the order, deeming it fiscally reckless and legally dubious, before finding a third, Roger B. Taney, who would comply. Biddle and the bank fought back with ferocity, contracting credit and calling in loans, deliberately inducing a financial panic to demonstrate the bank's necessity, and forced Jackson to relent. The economic pain was real and widespread. Businesses failed, workers lost their jobs, and delegations of desperate citizens flooded Washington, begging the president to reverse his course. But Jackson was immovable. Go to Nicholas Biddle. He roared at them. He has all the money. For Jackson, this was not an economic debate. It was a holy war. He was wrestling with a demon for the soul of the country, and any collateral damage was a necessary sacrifice in the fight for liberty. Even as this economic war raged, an even more perilous crisis erupted. In response to high federal tariffs that they claimed were crippling their economy, South Carolina, led by Jackson's estranged former Vice President John C. Calhoun, passed an ordinance of nullification, declaring the federal tariffs of 1828 and 1830 to null and void within the state. This was a direct challenge to the supremacy of federal law, a philosophical heir to the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, but now backed by the threat of secession. For Jackson, the populist champion of states' rights, this was the ultimate betrayal. He saw it not as a principled stand, but as treason. The man who had railed against the federal government's overreach now became its most ferocious defender. His response was immediate and unequivocal. To say that any state may at pleasure secede from the Union, he wrote, is to say that the United States is not a nation. He issued a fiery proclamation to the people of South Carolina, denouncing nullification as an impractical absurdity and as subversive doctrine. Privately, his fury was volcanic. He threatened to hang Calhoun and his co-conspirators as high as Haman. He asked Congress for a force bill, authorizing him to use the U.S. military to enforce the tariff laws in South Carolina. For a few terrifying months, the nation teetered on the precipice of civil war. The sight of federal troops marching on an American state seemed a real possibility. Ultimately, a compromised tariff engineered by Henry Clay averted disaster. But the crisis left deep and lasting scars. Jackson, the champion of popular will, had made it brutally clear that the will of the Union was supreme, a stand that would echo with profound consequences in the decades to come.